suicide in the end. We're just thrown back on this long-term human interest, right? Is that really an environmental ethic? I guess it's good, man. I mean, if that's the one that because we're all so anthropocentrized in our world, that's the one that, really does the trick in Washington, D.C., then all right. But it does kind of leave a bad taste in my mouth anyway. And I want to say, well, perhaps, Professor Norton is just not even, I don't know, we'll get to that when we read Christopher Stone. But there's some question as to whether or not this point of view does some of the work of resource extractors, right? Because this point of view frames the whole all resource management conflicts as though humans are the only ones at stake that have moral status. And if that's fundamentally wrong, then perhaps that's not a good road to go down. All right, so just keep that in mind, a cautionary note. So according to Norton, though, summing things up here, Leopold concluded in the course of his first 25 or so years of being a forester and a game manager that it's better to believe in hypothesis number 2. This is the more sustainable hypothesis. If we use this as the organizing principle of natural resource policy, then things will turn out much better in the long term. All right? So the belief in earth and land, air, water, wildlife as living organisms is more sustainable than belief in earth and land, air, water, wildlife as mechanisms. And we cannot know, ultimately, we just can't know, right? And Norton makes a big deal about Leopold's identifying this as a linguistic dispute, right? And Norton, it sounds kind of bizarre, it's just a linguistic, but what Leopold meant, according to Norton, is that these second-order beliefs involve metaphysical assumptions, right? And we'll never resolve them because they're metaphysical. Science doesn't have anything to say about them, right? So we cannot know. We cannot know whether the Earth is a mechanism, a set of dead mechanisms, or a set of living organisms. But we ought, nevertheless, we don't know the answer to that question, but we ought, nevertheless, to treat them as though they are living organisms and as though they have independent moral value, because that will benefit long-term human interests and sustain our community. All right? So there you have it. All right, yes?
So on that last one, is it basically that they're removing personal narrative from the philosophical player in the between which worldview you have? He's saying that personal narrative has to be a part of it. You can't.
That's part of a pragmatist outlook, I think. Sure, but I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. But yeah, your personal narrative, sure. I mean,
because that's what he has an issue with. The reason for his beliefs, and he's saying that his personal narrative is in conflict because his actions and his personal beliefs are different. He can't reconcile that. They have the time.
His personal narrative, for evidently Norton, this is fair to me, right? Because we know that Leopold was involved in the predator eradication program until the mid-1930s, right? So his personal narrative evidently was not in conflict with predator eradication, and his personal narrative didn't change. Norton says it seems kind of convincing, right? Because you just look at the evidence of what he did professionally. Right? What he put his stamp of approval on as a professional. And part of what he approved of was predator eradication right up until the mid-1930s. So evidently, according, you're trying to follow this trail of his evolution, the evolution of his own personal narrative. And Norton's convinced that the evolution of his own personal narrative was influenced far more by science than by any kind of metaphysical transformation. All right?
As opposed to in the story of the Thinking Like
As
a Mountain.
opposed to the Thinking Like a Mountain. He perhaps gives himself a little, he doesn't want to, but he also makes it clear that, he knows what he did was wrong, so it is his mea culpa, but he could have been a lot harder on himself, because he seems to suggest that he knew then, and ever since he knew, right? But what is knowledge? I don't know. What does it mean to know something if you're practically going against what you know? You know what I mean?
If you have the ability to put forth an argument, persuade generations, I think you did a pretty good job, whether or not your life's like,
Yeah.
technically, went around shooting animals. Like, if you started a movement and had a personal narrative that touched other people and convinced them, not through a philosophical argument that was void of personal narrative, he needed that in order to communicate to people.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, he's just a shining example of a principled approach to natural resource. He really did try to be objective, and just through all of his professional experience, that is what it meant to be objective, shifted over from an economic analysis slowly to an ecological analysis. So we'll get into a little bit of classical American, I have this movie too, but some of this stuff, I don't know how much of this we want to do. All right, well, we'll just start getting into this a little bit, and I did end up getting those two movies that I mentioned last week, but they were both in a VCR form, and the classrooms don't have, a few years ago they had VCRs, but they all got removed. So anyway, but I did find a really cool documentary about Leopold on YouTube, so maybe we could watch that. We'll see how much energy we have left. And then we'll take a break in about 10 minutes. So now we're going to kind of get in. Remember I said that we're not going to go heavy, and I'm not going to expect you to be proficient at answering the axiological question or doing axiological analysis of the nature of value until after the midterm. But because we have extra time, because I've been moving through this material more briskly than I thought that I would, that I decided to add some more lecture notes to this week. And we'll see how much of this catches on, whether or not it's helpful. So, stepping back to metaethics, questions about the nature of good, of ill, of obligation, of all these terms that ethicists use all the time. Metaethics just is an effort to analyze the meaning of these terms. Okay, that's a really simple definition of what metaethical analysis is. It's analysis of the meaning of key terms that ethicists rely on all the time, like good, ill, responsibility, obligation, value. Okay, according to William James, great classical American philosopher, and this is all from his famous essay published in, I believe, around 1890, called "The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life." And if you take a course in classical American philosophy, you'll certainly read it, but you can also read it on your own. It's very accessible. It's just a breath of fresh air, really. But according to William James, goodness, badness, obligation, responsibility must be realized somewhere in order really to exist. No merely inorganic nature of things can realize them. Neither moral relations nor the moral law can swing in a vacuum. Their only habitat can be a mind which feels them, and no world composed of merely physical facts can possibly be a world to which ethical propositions apply. But, magically, when only one sentient being appears, then goods and bads become possible. In a world with only one sentient being, however, it would be absurd to ask whether that being's judgments of good and bad are true or not. All right? Moral truth supposes a standard outside of the thinker, a standard to which the thinker must conform. The right system of morality in a world with only one truly sentient being, with only one sentient being, is simply the one which most satisfies that being. All right? So there's no truth. It's just totally subjective to that one sentient being. Right? There's no moral right or wrong. It's just whatever makes that entity, satisfies that entity. All right? However, when two or more sentient beings appear, the possibility of moral truth may emerge. Moral truth only emerges, however, if two or more sentient beings are not indifferent to each other's feelings and preferences. If the beings are indifferent to one another, there is still only subjectivism and relativism. No moral truth, no ethical unity. If two or more sentient beings care about each other's feelings and preferences, then the possibility of moral truth emerges. It's kind of amazing, really, if you think about it. Right? I mean, the universe didn't have a moral truth, and then at some point, it did. The classical American pragmatist's answer to the axiological question continued, I guess. It's a continuation of the previous page of notes. William James asserts that without a claim actually made by some concrete person, it's questionable, it's not clear what he means by some concrete person. He seems to mean more than just humans. But without a claim actually made by some, does he mean plants too, though? Or things like oysters or mushrooms? Right? Are they making claims? They seem to be, right? The tree makes claims on the sunshine and the water. So, Anyway, but without a claim actually made by something with the there, something with an interiority, right? Something where there's somebody home. There can be no moral obligation. Something where there's somebody caring, right? Something where there's something at issue, at stake. And there is some obligation wherever there is a claim. Okay, claim and obligation are coextensive terms, right? Claim and responsibility, right and responsibility, you could say. Right? Sometimes really important claims are defined as rights. Claim and obligation are coextensive terms. They cover each other exactly. Our ordinary attitude of regarding ourselves as subject to an overarching system of moral relations true in themselves is therefore an out-and-out superstition, or else it must be treated as a merely provisional abstraction from the thinking of a deity. Good, bad, value, and obligation have no absolute natures or meanings independent of personal support. They are objects of feeling and desire which have no foothold or anchorage in being, apart from the existence of actually living minds. By the way, this is all just in your face to the Kantians. This is all just challenging, throwing down the gauntlet. Because all this stuff that William James is rejecting, these are all things that the Kantians are asserting are true, right? That we do have, there is an overarching system of moral relations, true in themselves. That's what the Kantians believe. Okay? So William James, so you can imagine now, okay, remember we got the battle between the Neo-Humeans and the Neo-Kantians playing out all term long, right? And so William James, you now can categorize him, he's a Neo-Humean. And he does, he comes out of, William James dedicated his book, Pragmatism, actually, he dedicates it to John Stuart Mill, who's a utilitarian. We've already studied John Stuart Mill. And of course the utilitarians are also Neo-Humeans. Right? The utilitarians have much, much more in common with David Hume than they don't have anything in common with him. Jeremy Bentham referred to Kant's categorical imperative as nonsense on stilts. Of course, Kant, though, he's nobody to be trifled with. His rejoinder was, woe to those who creep through the serpent windings of utilitarianism. All right, which beings and or entities have moral status according to William James? A thing without an actually living mind cannot have moral status because it does not make any claims on any resources. All right. Now, what is actual living mind? Again, does a tree have an actual living mind? Some research suggests that yes, trees are sentient at this rudimentary level, and maybe their living mind is just pervasive throughout all of their tissues, right? Throughout their bark and their leaves and their roots. They seem to make claims, like I said, trees claim, right? They go shooting up there to grab that sunlight, right? If they're surrounded by other trees, they'll just try to go as fast as they can to get up into the sun. And of course, they send their roots down to claim whatever water's there. So, anyway, so it seems perhaps a pragmatist, according to William James, ought to be receptive to the idea that non-human entities and even trees are making moral claims, and therefore, perhaps there are moral obligations. That, right? Wherever there's a claim, there's an obligation. So. Of course, there are many other claims on us too, right? We might have a claim for a house or inexpensive paper, right? So that claim has to then fight it out with the tree's claim, right? And of course, the humans are going to win because we have all the technology. But perhaps the human ought not win. Anyway, a thing without an actual living mind cannot have moral status because it does not make claims on any resources. Humans can have moral obligations. This is a very Humean view, okay? Humans can have moral obligations only toward beings and entities that make claims on resources. Animals and other living beings, perhaps plants, perhaps all living beings, make claims on resources. On the other hand, though, is it plausible to suggest that ecosystems make claims on resources? I suspect it probably is that too. But there is a, this week we're just studying ecocentrism to the extent, that we're straying off the anthropocentric reservation at all, right? To the extent that we're off the reservation at all, we're studying ecocentrism. And next week is our week to study biocentrism. Not really study it, right? But Leopold and his followers are readily identified as ecocentrists, right? Of course, remember, but Leopold could also be an anthropocentrist, like Nordenson. And then Schweitzer, though, Schweitzer actually has a very significant disagreement and criticism of ecocentrism. And Schweitzer is someone that we today refer to as biocentrist. Where the ecosystem is not the ultimate moral status, but the every living organism, wherever there is a living being, the life-centered, right, as opposed to ecosystem-centered, but life-centered. So ecocentrism is different than biocentrism, significantly different. And perhaps William James's point of view would have a hard time. I don't know. I think it's not that hard to make sense of the claim that ecosystems also make claims on resources. There is a loose integrity to an ecosystem, right, which ecologists point out, observe. That's what we've observed. That's what ecologists teach us. That although the boundaries are fluid, they're loose. New organisms are coming in all the time, even without any human influence, right? New birds are flying, ways away, and salmon are coming and colonizing new streams, right? So an ecosystem, the boundaries of an ecosystem are porous, right, and fluid, but there's still a there. There's still an identity, right? It's slow changing over time. And so perhaps, we can think of as an ecosystem as having an interiority and making claims on resources. In which case an ecosystem may have some kind of moral status under William James's point of view. Anyway, now we get into a little bit of review. But let's take our break, all right? And we'll just make it a 6-minute break right now. So just come back and I'll start back up again at 1 o'clock. And I'll get our attendance sheet going around too, before I forget.
So feedback, it was these slides that you added yesterday that helped a lot of the stuff previously make more sense
Cool.
for me.
Uh-huh.
I'm going through it all and looking up some of the stuff individually and adding to it. It was really helpful for me.
Yeah, before you know it, you find yourself using the terminology and thinking that way pretty easily. It's my hope anyway, that we just kind of slide surreptitiously and smoothly
Yeah.
to the harder material. It's going to get harder, but
So I emailed you about missing class.
okay, yeah. Just did I mark you excused? What's your name?
No, it's okay. So,
Oh, you're gonna be excused coming up.
yes.
I don't have any attendance sheets for next week.
Okay. Well, I emailed you just so you know.
Just email me again when it's close to that day, all right?
Okay.
Or on that day even would be best.
Okay.
All right, thanks. For some reason, these speakers aren't playing anything. I don't know what's going on here. Why is it doing that? Well, we can't watch any movies if we don't have any speakers. Isn't that weird?
Sounds like there's some sound.
It's only coming from there, though. Normally, it's supposed to be hooked up over here. So yeah, this is the volume control here, and it's just cranked up. And the systems, and on the system, it's
Yeah.
see, it's totally cranked up on the system.
And on the video.
And on the video too, yeah.
Maybe it's just the source.
Well, we don't want to suddenly start having it blast away, so. But yeah, I bet there is some kind of a cable that's come out or. Is that it? Is it up here?
Yeah, it's one.
Maybe is it? Could there be like a?
I think that's just for something else.
That's like a DVD probably. Is this how I think not? I don't think it should be. No. This is the. This is the computer. Right? This guy. sound at all. So whatever you did, it needs to just go, it needs to be somewhere else. Where's that? Oh, yeah, that's all right. I mean, all right, well, seem to be having technical problems that are not surmountable. We can't seem to get our speakers connected to our PC.
Connect this to the computer directly, it doesn't do anything. Which is very weird.
All right, well, we're not going to worry about it, and it just wasn't meant to be, I guess. So I do have quite a bit more lecture material, and if we have to, you know, I mean, and I can talk about salmon for the next 3 hours easily. And I think, is that on the syllabus for today? Maybe I know that that's one of our big narratives, one of our big moral struggles that I want to cover before we get to the midterm. Let's see. Today I asked you to read Brian Norton, and yeah, The Ethics of Salmon Restoration, as illustrated in the Morals. Today we're supposed to talk a little bit about the 4 lower Snake River dams. My friend has already agreed, who's written a couple books now on the Snake River, has already agreed to come and talk to us, and he's on our schedule later in the term. So we'll have an opportunity later to talk about the Snake River, those 4 lower Snake dams too. But because I want to set this up in order to get ready for our midterm, then we can go over the basics of salmon, our salmon ecosystem, if you want. But in the meantime, we have a lot more of these lecture slides that I can use. So for an environmental pragmatist, this is again stepping back, you know, and taking a broad and deep view of pragmatist epistemology and pragmatist moral philosophy. For environmental pragmatists, true and good natural resources policy can only be determined with reference to living sentient beings who are actively trying to live flourishing lives in harmony with their communities. Truth in natural resource management is that set of assertions about human use of natural resources which is most likely to prevail in the long run, given certain social and ecological conditions. The truth in any particular situation is that which is sustainable in light of all other known truths which are relevant to that situation. So again, it's not anything goes. You know, there are crazy people who believe that, you know, the banging of the window screen in the basement is the tapping of a ghost or something, right? But anybody who gets up and goes to investigate where the sound is coming from can go downstairs and notice that, well, the window's open, the screen is tapping, you know, against the window like that because there's a breeze and there's not a ghost, right? But there can be crazy people, but their views, their explanations of reality are just not going to be very compatible with the rest of their lives or with other people's lives. And so it's not anything goes, right? It has to be consistent with everything else that we know about the world. The truth in any particular situation is that which is sustainable in light of all other known truths which are relevant to that situation. The good in natural resource management is that set of assertions about natural resource values which is most compatible with respect for all the other sorts of values that are interwoven with natural resource values. A good policy regarding some given set of natural resources is one which is consistent with sustaining as many as possible of the other values known to be associated with that set of natural resources. All right, and here it's helpful to call on, and Norton does this too. In his other writings, he calls on, sometimes without giving proper credit, he relies on John Dewey's, this other major, probably William James and John Dewey are the two most important American philosophers. John Dewey was 1859 to 1952, somewhat younger than William James, and he also lived a really long time. But John Dewey draws this helpful distinction between the valued and the valuable. And he identifies the valued in just straight up empirical terms. The valued is whatever anybody, any human or non-human, sentient, living mind, animal, values. All right? So the valued is a very broad class of things, whatever people or other, perhaps non-human people, happen to value or prize. All right? Whatever empirically people happen to value or prize is the valued. Okay? The valuable. And Norton draws this distinction. He kind of changes the terms a little bit. He wants to talk about the distinction between felt preferences, which would be the same as Dewey's the valued, and considered preferences, which would be the same as Dewey's the valuable. So for Dewey, the valuable and considered preferences for Norton is a much narrower class of things. That which a fully informed person continues to identify as valuable after comprehending its effect on the web of other values with which it is connected. Okay? So we have to, in order to know what's truly valuable among all the things that people tend to value, we have to run all the values through this conceptual apparatus that identifies all the other values that they're connected to and how they affect those other values. So not everything, and I have these different bizarre little examples. Blood diamonds, you know, is one of my favorite. I don't know why, but I hit on these examples and I just use them over and over again, even if I realize that maybe they're not working that well. But anyway, the blood diamonds, right? I think, okay, somebody gets a hold of some diamonds and they're really pretty. Let's say you bought them at a garage sale and they were on, you know, a really good price, and you're proud of them, right? And you wear them all the time, and you know, you wear them to a party, and you're proud of them, right? Because you value them, because you know that. But that's before you found out where they came from. And then someone sees them who knows about diamonds, and hey, you know what those are? Those are those diamonds from the Congo that all these people are killing each other over, just causing all kinds of resource devastation and cultural, you know, things are really bad over there because of these diamonds. And so you really shouldn't be trafficking in those things, and you sure shouldn't even be wearing them. At that point, your valuing of those diamonds completely changes because you become aware of the context, right? And you realize that those diamonds are not consistent with all the other values that you hold, you know, growing up in Portland and being raised, you know, properly by decent people. You realize that this is